Hello everyone, welcome to those who haven't been here before, welcome back to those who have watched before. Thanks for coming again. My name is Leah Langley, and let's get right into the 6 books I read in February 2026. A really great list of books, to be fair, and it actually came at a good time for me because I talked about briefly at the end of my January book video. I kind of was been a little bit of like this reading slump, and a lot of these books honestly came, like me reading like 6 in this month came in like almost necessity because it was like the library holds I had on them for a while, whatever were ending. It was like, okay, I have to like, this is the time where I'm going to lose it from the library. Nothing like pressure like that to get you to like lock in and get through these books. And yeah, that's really where the journey started, I guess, in kind of a sense. But really, really great books. I gave them all high ratings, and I would recommend pretty much all of them, honestly. But let's dive right in. I also want to say, as I always try to, follow me on Goodreads at Leah Langley. I also recently made a story graph at the very end of January. I haven't like said that to anybody at this point. If you guys have story graph, you should be able to find me there. My name is there is also Leah Langley, I believe. I've been trying to log some things there. I got recommended story graph like a couple years ago at this point, never like logged on, but I like the graphs and charts they make of your books. And so I've just been kind of slowly putting my stuff on there, and I like incorporated or like, merged my Goodreads profile history, things like that. So if you're on Storygraph, go ahead and do that if you want, if you're not on Goodreads. But yeah, enough of the chatter. Very first book of the year, and this is very first book of February, excuse me, and this is book 4 of 2026, is Men We Reet, a memoir by Jesmyn Ward. Jesmyn Ward, I first read one of her books, Lest We Descend, a couple years ago. This novel, really great work. And I forget exactly how this kind of came up. It might have come up a little bit around when I read Heavy, which was like my last book of 2025 by Cassie Lemon. I think that might have come up around then, this book as one of my potential reads. And it's a beautiful book. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5. It's a beautiful memoir centered around the grief of 5 men she lost within 4 years, from 2000 to 2004, and kind of these pivotal moments in her life. And Ward walks us through these losses and her life at that time. First, the first 4 losses are kind of the four men, but then we end the book with the first loss and the hardest of them all for her, the loss of her younger brother Joshua. He was killed by a drunk driver when he was 19. She was 23. I feel like ending the book there, like after kind of like this whole lead up of her kind of noting these losses in her life and the whole like kind of journey that she had been on. And we're like, I was trying to get the quote, but it was basically kind of was like, and now going to like the loss that started, that happened before Richard, before Roger, before CJ, all these things. And it was like, oh yeah, like her brother died. And I knew that coming into the book, but the way she wrote about it as like the ending piece was really just like, centered around, it felt like it made it feel even more like intentional for her to do that, but also felt more devastating after we kind of been through everything in the book and kind of circling back to him after all of that. While this book is about those losses, it also, again, is a memoir, and it is about rural poverty and race and how that ties into these 5 losses. She definitely stays with the grief heavily, and I think that's something I definitely connected to in the piece. But like she doesn't like in terms of staying with it, she doesn't like rush past it or like try to pack it into something kind of like, neat or inspirational. It's, grief can be often, very messy and just like, one day at a time type of thing, or 1 hour, 1 minute. But she shows like how like structural racism, economic abandonment, addiction, limited healthcare, access, and generational trauma often create the conditions in which these deaths become almost predictable. Not necessarily accidents and isolation, especially among Black men, but like symptoms of like a larger systemic issue that has filled many Black communities in the rural South in particular. And she grew up in Mississippi, and that's really just like enough said if you know anything about Mississippi. She goes into those like a little bit, but like mostly it's about grief. I've seen some people say like, they wish she dug into that more. I think she did it a decent amount, because it's like it doesn't really have to be said, or you can read something else to kind of get those connections. But it really is a beautiful work, a beautiful memoir. I really quite enjoyed it. So that was the first book for February. The second book for February and the fifth book for the year is a wonderful book that I knew the story of. It's Bridge to Terabithia by Catherine Patterson. I feel like many people my age experienced the magical world of Terabithia through the 2007 film adaptation that had Josh Hutcherson and Anna Sophia Robb as the stars. And that film, broke all of our hearts. I was trying to figure out, rack my brain, like when I might have seen that film for the first time. I don't necessarily know when I saw it for the first time, but I remember seeing it, or not necessarily remember seeing it, but I remember like being very broken up by the ending of that film. And I recently learned, or maybe rather like was reminded of the book and decided to read it and also rewatch the film, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Just as the film was my first experience, so I was like able to like kind of gear up for where the ending was going to go, but just like the film, it breaks your heart in the end, but it really leans into that like beautiful imagination and sense of adventure that comes with childhood. And I enjoyed going back to Terabithia and like meeting it through Patterson, who's the originator here. And I know I would have enjoyed this book if I had read it as a child. And yeah, it was just a nice read. I didn't say this, but I gave it a 4 out of 5. Right after reading this book, I rewatched the film. I remember I was gonna maybe pop on and like say something about just after I just like watched the film as well, which is again right after coming off reading the book, but I didn't get a chance to. I was kind of like emotional, but I think it kind of was because certainly just off the book, but also like again I kind of like went like the next day I think right into the film, kind of as I touched on like that beautiful sense of like adventure and imagination that you have in childhood. Being able just to like venture out and make up worlds, make up stories, make up things to do with your friends and things like that. And it just had me thinking a lot about that beautiful imagination and that beautiful kind of just like anything, you could do anything when you're a kid, when you feel just like it's just a beautiful, I don't know, it was just like I was thinking about that a lot while reading it, while watching the film, and just like reflecting, even thinking about my own personal, like going out with friends in the neighborhood and, doing just all types of random things. And I didn't necessarily, at least maybe I don't remember like making up complete worlds and things like that. But again, it's like when you're a child, it's like, you just have, again, as I've said a couple times now, just this beautiful sense of imagination, just so much adventure and like, do this, try that, just like it's just a beautiful thing. And I was just thinking about that a lot as I was watching the film. And I was like literally crying over it as well, as I was thinking about it. And then also, of course, the ending as well, which is sad. And the thing is too, in the book, that the film didn't go into as much. It was kind of like, I was connecting a little bit too as well. After the loss of Leslie, who was the two characters are Jess and Leslie. After the loss of Leslie, the way Jess copes with it initially is like, he's like in complete denial, like, oh yeah, Leslie's not dead. Like, are you guys crazy? The next day I come downstairs and Mom's making me all these pancakes and saying like, oh, you don't have to do your chores, whatever. He's like, whatever. Like connecting to that in terms of like, especially when you're young, having that just immediate, just like denial, like, no, like, and just the way like the book went to a little bit more as he was trying to like explore his grief in terms of like losing his friend so suddenly, that really touched me. And then it was just a beautiful read, beautiful to like rewatch the film. I hadn't seen it in years. And yeah, really, really, really nice read. I would recommend you watching the film if you haven't, reading the book if you haven't. Again, like I said, I think I would have certainly enjoyed this when I was a kid, reading this book. So I would encourage you to do that if you have kids in your life. All right, book 3 for February 2026, and this is book 6 for the year, is The Personal Librarian. This is by Marie Benedict and Victoria Christopher Murray. This book had been on my radar for a while. I actually have it here, should have held it up. This book has been on my radar for a while. This was recommended I read this as part of my book club. This was recommended for our book club to read like at least 2 years ago. This book came out, I think, in 2021. At least 2 years ago, this was recommended and finally got around to it. And it's excellent. I also gave this a 4 out of 5 on my reads. And beautiful book. It's about the life of Belle Marion Greener, who passed as white for decades as Belle DaCosta Green. She was the personal librarian for J.P. Morgan, yes, that J.P. Morgan, and the first director of the Pierpont Morgan Library, which is now called the Morgan Library and Museum. The story reads like is a historical fiction work, but it closely follows Belle's actual life, capturing both her brilliance and complexities of navigating race, identity, and society in the early 20th century America. After Reconstruction was stripped away and the very real fear of what more Black people would have to endure, Belle's mother decided that the family would pass. They had to cut their Washington, D.C. roots and instead claim their olive skin came from their Portuguese grandmother. This led to her civil rights fighting father to leave them, as he did, he wasn't with this decision, and we follow Belle through, the pros and cons of that decision her mother made, essentially. Passing as white was a risk for many in this period, but especially for Belle and her family as she continued to rise to such prominence as Morgan's personal librarian. She had to constantly protect herself and in turn her family from being found out. Because she has the secret she has to keep, she doesn't let anyone get too close. When she does let someone in, she is betrayed and discarded. I was pissed off about that. Yet she persists and stamps her legacy in the history books forever. Belle kept the secret her whole life, even burning her personal letters shortly before her death in 1950, when she was age 70, to make sure it remained uncovered. She herself did not have children, but who knows how many of her descendants are out there living lives that they might not have had if not for her. The world learned that in 1999 that Belle DeCosta Green was actually Belle Marion Greener when a biographer found her original 1879 birth certificate with the C for colored. Something else I really appreciated about this book, I found myself a lot, the language of this book is just excellent. I found myself a lot highlighting and looking up several words and stopping to read to be I knew what the words meant because they were in these sentences in these certain ways, but I was I want to see the actual definition of this and noting oh, this is a good, some of these words that they were using back then, I was oh, this could be a good word to I hadn't heard this really ever or in a while, things like that. It was some of them were new, some of them were just ones I hadn't heard of before or were ones that were somewhat common or whatever. But I was I was stopping myself a lot, picking up words and oh, this is good, this is good, this is good. Some people in my book club even, they shared after, one person in particular wrote a bunch of notes of the words in the books actually, and even my sister as well was someone who said she was doing similar things to me, and it was just something else that made you pull yourself into this early 20th century. Everything else about the book too as well was just so clear and so easy to imagine and kind of follow and think about each moment. I don't even know if it's because part of the thing, I remember they said something about the Mauritania, and I was thinking about Titanic is my favorite film of all time, and I was thinking oh, I know that from the movie Titanic, and I don't know, but some of these things it was very easy to just imagine and just get into the book in that way as well. And this is just an excellent book that has introduced me to Belle. I hope one day to visit the Morgan Library and learn more about her and appreciate what she was able to put together. This is great. This is again one of those one of those quote unquote hidden people that you don't get to learn about. And in general, the around this book of passing and things like that, I've read several things now that have talked about passing either directly or kind of it's just one of the characters in the book. Book on my shelf right back there, The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, is something that talks about passing. We have one sister who's passing, one sister who's not. This excellent book called it's called Passing by, I forget who it's by. Came out a couple years ago. Let me look up who it's by. I had the name in my head, but I can't remember. Oh yeah. The book Passing by Nella Larson is a book I read after seeing the film adaptation a couple years ago. Excellent film that has Ruth Negga and Tessa Thompson in it. And that's all about passing and things like that. And many people did that back in those days, and those who could, obviously, if you had a certain skin tone, that you could try to do it. And we're following Belle again as she's going through this period. We're hearing her inner monologue sometimes when, let's say, she's at this auction and she beat all these boys to get this piece of art, and it was well, can they even believe that they just got beat by a woman, let alone if they knew I was a Black woman all along, or things like that. It's just just a really interesting story, thinking about so much weight she was carrying, again, trying to keep the secret for everybody. while also rising to such prominence in terms of being able to be financially stable suddenly and be able to support her family in that way and like give them chances for different things in their life. And yeah, it was, like I said, it was something that a lot of people had to consider. A lot of people chose to do. A lot of people didn't choose to do. And as I said, who knows, like with her family specifically, who knows how many people are out there still like who have connections to her and maybe don't even necessarily know it or don't want to claim it because, you know, they've created this different life for themselves or who knows what. Just a really interesting story. And I know they took liberties and they explained some of the liberties they took in their author's notes. But they really followed closely with her life and her kind of like history and story. And again, like I said, I hope to visit the Morgan Library sometime and yeah, learn more about her. All right, what is this? Book four for February 2026. And this is the 7th book overall, is Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology by Chris Miller. This is another really great book. I gave this a 4 out of 5 as well. Let me like read this thing I wrote out here because I think it's pretty good, but it also really encapsulates a lot of my thoughts on this. Not only does Taiwan produce 90% of the world's most advanced chips, but it does so while being at risk of severe weather due to its location in the Pacific, and it's well documented that it's under threat of a takeover by China, which has long considered it a breakaway territory. This is obviously a huge problem, and this is how I got in thinking about this like disaster. First off, and most importantly, a severe weather event or a war with China would be horrible for the people of Taiwan. I want to say that first and foremost, and many could be lost. But this book is looking at the technology side of it and what could happen if the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, if their chip production came to a halt. I first looked into this looming economic disaster by reading Apple in China by McGee last year. I have it right over there. Excellent book, really great book, you should read that. In chapter 41 in that book, it's called A Staggering Vulnerability, TSMC. McGee quotes from Chip War, saying it would be out of business on day one of the war. McGee goes on to explain how such cessation and production would have disastrous effects on the world economy. That's on page 373. I looked it up. I was like, when did you know? Yeah, anyways, through reading that book and thinking about this vulnerability, I became more interested in this key technology and the precarious position Silicon Valley has put itself and the world in. Federal officials and Silicon Valley itself have tried to wean themselves off their dependence on Taiwan, similar to how Apple has with China as of late. But it almost feels too late because so many systems are already in place, and even a day's pause could lead to economic disaster. Does Taiwan's crucial role in the market make it safer from a potential takeover by China? Maybe, but that's not a very safe bet. Chip War details the history of this crucial technology and the geopolitical struggle we are now facing. The world is now dependent on these chips in every way you can imagine, from personal use to military power. Even if you're a Luddite, everyone could take an interest in this situation because it affects all of us, but especially if you're interested in electronics, economics, or politics, this book is for you. I was waiting for this book for a long time. I was really excited to read it. Again, like I said, after reading Apple in China, I said, okay, I'm going to be reading this book. I'd heard about it, but then I never read it. And then I thought about it again when it's only referenced once, like directly once in Apple in China. But this whole kind of thing of, situation's bad. I was like, this is another book I want to read. I remember this one and whatnot. And I picked it up and read it. And it was really, really excellent and really illuminating in terms of digging into chips specifically, in terms of this great technology that we have that we're also dependent on, and like this as literally it is this chip war. This book was released in 2022. I actually just saw when I was writing my review for this, someone just posted like a couple days ago a New York Times article, about this looming disaster. I'll link it below. And yeah, it's a very active thing many people are thinking about. So as I said, Silicon Valley has put itself and the world in this very precarious situation. Not even just for Silicon Valley, but even like things with China and things like that. And as you're thinking about now, it's like certain people are like, oh, we want to do more production stuff in like the United States. It's like, but it's not necessarily possible in the way that people think it is. And it's not just going to be like a snap of a finger thing, even if it ever would happen. So it's very crucial, these things. And as I said, this affects every single person. Some people You may not even know necessarily the whole in-depths of what chips are, as Miller goes into the depths of like chips and like, again, like I said, the history of this crucial technology and like breaking down, oh, this is this piece and that. And I was like, some of those things I wasn't as interested in. But chips are really like everybody, it's going to affect everybody in a serious way. Yeah, really great book, really great. I think, as I said, if you're interested in electronics, economics, or politics, read this book. Certainly if you're interested in all three, definitely read this book. All right, now we are to the final two books I read in February 2026. Has something to do with the reason why I'm wearing this hoodie right now. Thank you, Focus Features. The fifth book I read in February 2026, and the eighth book overall, is The Tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark by William Shakespeare, or just Hamlet as commonly referred to. This is a play, yes, but as we know, I don't have the actual book here with me, but as we know, they have made these, shout out Folger, Shakespeare Library, they make these into these, they put these into books. I have a copy from high school of Much Ado About Nothing I had to read in Miss Somerville's class, and went to go to Stratford, Ontario to go watch the play. I'm really digressing here. So they obviously put these into books to read. This book, I've never been into Shakespeare. Even as I referenced Much Ado About Nothing, I remember reading that, kinda, and like going up to Stratford. I remember I fell asleep during it was a long day. I fell asleep during the play, and I just was not really like in it. I was kind of just like, it was not my vibe. It's not my vibe. But I began thinking about Shakespeare differently late last year when Chloe Zhao, the director of Hamnet, whose first language is not English, said something that an actor, Paul Mescal, told her after she was struggling to kind of keep up with some of the language or whatnot. He said, this is kind of paraphrased, I couldn't remember the exact quote. Shakespeare is not about understanding every word spoken, but rather about like the emotional response you get from it. And that really couldn't be more true. Before I even keep going a little bit more, Hamnet, the whole like third act of Hamnet is basically Hamlet on screen. And the emotion that came out of me watching that movie and that like the whole scene, it's been well talked about how Hamlet's one of my favorite movies of 2025. The emotion, I remember starting in that, as that movie was playing and they went to the Hamlet piece. So I remember sitting there and starting to get too caught up on like exactly what the language was and like what are they saying and what's going on here and yada yada. And then at some point like didn't matter anymore because I was just like in it and feeling it and just like completely just like, I remember if you've seen it in my videos on Hamlet, I was crying for like a while after watching that, and like it kind of kept going for like weeks and weeks as I was thinking about it again and whatnot. So for me, reading Hamlet was like a precursor to reading Hamnet, which is my next book that I read for February. And what an excellent work this is. Shocker, what an excellent work this is. But the thing is, I knew nothing about Hamlet, honestly. Some of the quotes I've heard, like to be or not to be, but I didn't know like what Shakespeare work that was from. Several things while reading this like stood out to me that I was familiar with. I was like, oh, I've heard that. And I really enjoyed it. And what I decided to do, which I think I really would recommend, I've read one other Shakespeare, other than Much Ado About Nothing, I don't really count that, but I've read one other Shakespeare work recently. I read King Lear a couple years ago. Maybe it was last year. I think it was last year, yeah. I think it worked out with Hamlet because Hamlet is, one of Shakespeare's, like most famous plays and like his masterpiece, things like this. I would recommend this for anybody who like is gonna like read Shakespeare or whatever. What I did was I watched Shakespeare. I watched Hamlet. I went on YouTube, and I pulled up a performance of Hamlet. I was trying to find one, a full performance. I wanted to find one like in England with English actors, things like that. But I wasn't able to find one. Fixing my hair here. Wasn't able to find one. So I ended up just settling on like one of the only full ones that was really left on there. That was a drama school in North Carolina. I'm doing it. And that was fine, that was good and things like that and whatever. And then I read Hamlet, thought it was excellent reading it. And then what I did was something I was going to do first, but then I stopped when I realized it was a more modern take on it, a slightly modern take on it. I watched Andrew Scott's Hamlet when he did it in like 2017, 2018 on the West End, got a Laurence Olivier nomination, things like that. I watched that performance of Hamlet and was just completely blown away. Just like, that was exceptional. I really I would link it, but I don't want it to be taken down, so I'm not going to link it. I would highly recommend watching that because I was just like blown out of the water. And this was right after, again, obviously I'd watched it before reading the book. I read the book, so I knew it was going to happen, I guess, but it was the first one I thought it was fine, but it was really just like, I want to like read it and like I want to get to Andrew Scott's situation. Reading it was really engaging, really great, and then like the watching it, the Andrew Scott performance was like exceptional. And that one I had seen, I hadn't seen it, but I'd seen people talking about his like soliloquy, to be or not to be, and like that had been going around before and things like that, and I'd never seen it. And the only reason I didn't do it first, or I ended up doing both of them actually, is just because since it was a more modern take, I was like, if I'm gonna watch it the first time, I want it to be like as like traditional as possible, in a sense. So they had some like little liberties they took, or not liberties, but like they had like computers and things like that and TV screens, and I was like, oh, that was not around when Shakespeare was writing this. But yeah, I honestly am glad I'm like happy that I've finally read and seen this masterpiece from Shakespeare, and yeah, I highly recommend it. If you haven't done it yet, I highly recommend it. I probably would have put it on the screen by now, but I gave this a 4 out of 5. Very good. And now that brings us to the final book of February, my 6th book of February, my 9th book overall for the year, is Hamnet. Again, as I said, I wore this hoodie for a reason. Again, thank you, Focus Features. This novel is stunning. Stunning. Hamnet draws on O'Farrell's fascination. The book is by Maggie O'Farrell. It draws on her fascination with the little-known story behind one of Shakespeare's most famous and mysterious works, Hamlet. As soon as I heard about the movie, I knew I wanted to read the book. But after seeing the movie, I knew I had to read the book. I will say I have this copy of, in the light here, I have this copy of Hamlet, but it is the movie, or Hamnet, excuse me, but it is like a movie. It's not the movie poster, but it's like the movie figures on it. And I, in general, I'm not someone who likes when like a movie poster is put on a book. I rather like keep it with the actual cover of the book. But I know, again, this was the Focus Features thing, as was the hoodie. So I was like, okay, whatever, I have it. Nothing I could do about it. But yeah, the book literally opens with, as a historical note, in the 1580s, a couple living on Henley Street, Stratford, had 3 children, Susanna, then Hamnet, and Judith, who were twins. The boy Hamnet died in 1596, aged 11. 4 years or so later, the father wrote a play called Hamlet. This would make anyone curious, I feel like given the closeness of the names, and apparently Hamnet and Hamlet were interchangeable at this time. But this book is not about Shakespeare. Literally not. O'Farrell doesn't even write his name throughout the whole novel. Shakespeare's name is not said, not William, not Will, not Shakespeare, is not said once in the book. And I wanted to say in the movie as well, they say William Shakespeare's name once towards the end, and after that, Annis maybe says Will twice. So it's not about Shakespeare. Instead, the book focuses on the family, Annis Shakespeare most of all, and particularly, her life with William, the 3 children, and how she navigates the violent loss of her beloved son, which causes a bigger divide between her and William, who missed the death and who shortly thereafter returns to London to work. In the book, he's just referred to as the husband, the father, the playwright. He's not named. Obviously, you know who it is, because it's like, we know who wrote Hamlet, but he's not named. It's only when Annis, in search for her husband, actually, he hadn't spoken to her in a while, hadn't stopped writing letters. She didn't even know Hamlet was happening. She thought he was doing a comedy, and then ends up being kind of like told about it through her stepmother, who she like despises. In search for her husband, she goes to the Old Globe and sees the performance of Hamlet. And it's in that moment when she can begin to understand some of what William has been going through and how like he's expressing his deep grief through art. And she sees like, oh, we're similar and we're alike. Like, I didn't maybe recognize the way you're grieving our beloved Hamnet, but we just do it different ways. And it's kind of like she's able to be like, it's like the father's taking the place for the son, and it's like that whole thing. Hamlet is a novel, but O'Farrell honestly breathed so much life into these people and this loss, who have been, I saw someone say this and I really like this, have been like consigned to literary footnotes. Yes, it is a fictional account. You know, we, outside of knowing that Hamnet did die in 1596, and a couple years later, 4 years later or so, Shakespeare wrote, you know, Hamlet, his one of, you know, his masterpiece, really. You know, she took liberties in terms of, we don't necessarily know what he died from, or is this actually connected? Who knows? But it's just a beautiful, beautiful story. And the thing is, since again, Hamnet is one of my favorite films of the year, reading through this book, I was able to just kind of like instantly just like imagine and like place the characters in the movie in the book as we were reading. And the thing that's interesting about this book as well is very much, again, from the first page, you know, Hamnet dies. And we go from like moments to like before Hamnet died to like the lead up to Hamnet dying, or like Judith being sick, to like back to before. So it's like you keep cutting these moments of cutaways to be like, oh, Hamnet is like trying to grab someone to help Judith, and it's like you keep leading up to it, and know it's like coming, and then of course it crashes and it comes, and then like that's like all of part one, that kind of lead up. It ends with his death in part one, and then part two is just like one long chapter of like post Hamnet dying, and like Anna's like kind of struggling through and trying to just like her and William kind of like breaking apart, being disconnected from each other because they're like grieving in their own different ways and not being able to understand each other. And then obviously the ending, seeing Hamlet unfold and whatnot, and them moving to Stratford, and like all these things. It's just beautiful. The film is excellent. I've talked about the film at length. If you haven't seen any of my other videos on the film, you should. I've talked about it at length, and I was so glad to read this book again. This was one of the ones again that came from the library. I had a certain amount of time to read it. So I was like, okay, shoot, I gotta read this book. I didn't actually get this copy of the book until after I'd already began or whatnot, but yeah, excellent work. Again, I keep forgetting to say, I probably already put it on the screen, but I gave this a 4 out of 5. Really, really great read. All right, I think that's enough for me. I think we made it through everything. 6 books for February 2026. As I said, 6 really great books. I think, yeah, I was happy to read it. Every single one of them got me back in again to my my reading. I do think though for March I'm probably going to be watching a lot more film. I've kind of missed. I've still watched a lot of, comparatively to a lot of people, I still watch a lot of films. But it is like Oscar season. Speaking of Hamnet, so I have a lot of films that have like kind of been on my. Not even, I've seen all the Oscar nominated films, but like just other movies and things. It's like dig into the movies a little bit more. But yeah, I'm happy for this month because it kind of got me back into like being excited about some of the reads and picking up some great things. You know, getting those juices flowing again. But yeah, as always, send me recommendations for books you're reading, things you've liked, things you've not liked. Have you read any of these books? Let me know in the comments, all that kind of thing. Follow me on Goodreads at Aaliyah Langley. Again, if you have Storygraph, I've just like joined Storygraph. You can follow me there as well at Aaliyah Langley. And all the other socials and things, they'll all be linked below in my link tree, so you could find me in those places. But yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks so much.